Hello everyone and welcome back to the series where I talk about myself and my life in music. Today I'm going to tell you about my favorite musicians who aren't guitarists. If you want to hear about my favorite guitarists, I'll link to that video in the description. Let's dive in. To start things off is one of my favorite drummers of all time, Ringo Starr, whose brilliance is often understated, which makes sense when you play in the same band as Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and John Lennon. But his contribution to the Beatles can't be denied. What I love so much about Ringo is that he essentially wrote riffs on the drums. His parts are as important to those Beatles classics as anything else in the ensemble. Take for example Come Together. If you heard the drum part on its own, you would instantly know what song it is. No one would ever say that Ringo has the best chops in the world, but his feel is undeniable and his musicality is as good as it gets. He first and foremost plays the songs, and there's a lot of beauty in the simplicity he brings to the table. We should all strive to be a bit more like Ringo. For a listening recommendation, I'm going to go with the song In My Life, which has the most perfectly sparse and creative drum part. There's also a video on YouTube where a bunch of the biggest names in drumming talk about what made Ringo so great. It's cool to hear them gush about Ringo's playing. Check that one out, I'll put it in the description. Next up is a composer who I know very little about. If I walked by him on the street, I would never recognize him, but his music had a huge impact on my life. Koji Kondo. If you're wondering who that is, he's the guy who composed all those great Nintendo themes, from the very first Mario to Mario Odyssey, all the Zelda titles, and a whole bunch of other stuff. This music is truly the music of my childhood, and I've fallen even more in love with it ever since I started covering video games on my channel. The writing is amazing, music is about capturing a feeling, and few can do that as well as Koji. On top of that, think about how catchy those classic soundtracks are. If I play Mario 3, I'm going to be singing that soundtrack for days on end. There's also a lot of subtle brilliance that I only discovered when I started breaking down his compositions. For example, in Mario 64, there's a chord progression with a descending bass line that happens in almost every single B section of all the compositions. It's not obvious, but it has a subconscious effect of creating unity between all the songs. I have two pieces of recommended listening. The Ocarina of Time soundtrack is truly a masterpiece, tied for the best video game music ever, in my opinion, with Mario 64. Dire Dire Docks might be my favorite video game song of them all. Moving on, we have a saxophonist named Hank Mobley. When I was at school for music, I was studying, playing, and listening to a lot of jazz. While I enjoyed most of it, I didn't love it like I did a lot of other musics. That is, until I discovered Hank Mobley. Every day I would go to my school's library and take out a CD that I would listen to that night. One of these albums was Hank Mobley's Soul Station, which is definitely jazz, but it has that deep, dark groove of the blues. I learned the style was called hard bop and I loved it. I've stolen a lot of licks from Hank and I plan on stealing many more. Unlike a lot of saxophone players, he isn't about the flash or crazy harmony, but rather about the feel and emotion. My recommended listening is of course the album Soul Station, specifically the song Dig Dis. Even if you aren't a big jazz fan, check it out, I think you might like it. Next up is a Canadian icon and the lead singer of the tragically hip Gord Downie. And if you're not from my home country, you may not have even heard of him. They're a good old rock and roll band that made a name for themselves in the 80s and 90s. They never really had a huge amount of fame abroad, but back home they're commonly known as the Canadian Beatles. Among the things that set them aside is that Gord sang about life in Canada. There are songs about places that are only a couple hours from my home. There are references that only Canadians would get, which is something we don't really hear of much on radio. Growing up, their music was all over the place. To me, the tragically hip just sound like home. Aside from being a great frontman, singer, and lyricist, Gord staunchly fought for what he believed in. Watching their last concert before Gord passed away from cancer was a very heavy experience. I look up to the man not just as a musician, but as a person. For recommended listening, I'm going to go with the album Fully Completely, which is best consumed blasted over a boombox in the middle of the winter while playing shinny with the boys at the ODR. My next favorite non-guitar playing musician is the banjo player Béla Fleck. Béla is to banjo what Jimi Hendrix is to guitar. Traditionally, banjo is thought of as a bluegrass and country instrument, but Béla turned it into something so much more. Him and his band, the Flecktones, play what I would call jazz fused with everything else. It's weird, it's wonderful, and it's guided by Béla's virtuosic banjo playing. He has the chops of a classical player. In fact, one of my favorite albums by him is a series of duets with the upright bass player named Edgar Meyer. That album is called Music for Two. Besides that record, my recommended listening is a live album called Live Art, specifically the songs New South Africa and Sunset Road. Moving on is the singer, songwriter, pianist Regina Spektor. Around 2006 or so, I was watching Late Night with Conan O'Brien, and she was his musical guest. She played her song Fidelity, just her and a piano, and my mind was blown. I remember Conan coming up to her after and saying something like, "That was one of my favorite performances in a long time." And this is a man who has live music on every one of his shows. From there, I bought her album Begin to Hope, which is also my recommended listening. There are clearly a lot of musical influences at work, but she ties it all together with immaculate piano work, an incredible ear for catchy, relatable pop songs, and a beautiful voice. Next on my list is the fretless bass pioneer Jaco Pastorius. The story goes that sometime in the 70s, Jaco found himself at the same club as Joe Zawinul, who was leading the legendary fusion group Weather Report. Jaco, entirely unknown at the time, walked up to Joe. Joe asked him who he was, and he said, "I am John Francis Pastorius, and I'm the greatest bass player in the world." Joe told him to take a hike, but not long after, he heard a rough mix of Jaco's debut album, and soon after, he invited Jaco to join his band. Now, I will tell you, this is a terrible networking technique, unless of course you are the greatest bass player in the world, which to many Jaco was. He played the bass like a lead instrument, jazz phrasing with the funkiest of grooves. He also did this on a fretless electric, which is a sound that he made famous. The man battled some serious demons and passed away at the age of 35, but he left us with some phenomenal music. I recommend his debut album, which kicks off with the jazz standard Donnelly performed as a duet with just him and a conga player before rocking into the funky jam Come On, Come Over. And lastly, Freddie Mercury. I don't need to go on and on about what I like about him, because if you've heard him sing, I'm sure you get it. Even if you don't necessarily like what he does, you gotta be able to respect it. He's one of the most acclaimed singers and frontman, and is deserving of every single accolade. Recommended listening is Night at the Opera, which is probably Queen's magnum opus. If you haven't heard it, what are you doing? There you have it, my list of my favorite musicians who aren't guitarists. Let me know a couple people on your list. I'm always happy to read what you guys have to say in the comments. Remember, you can buy Samurai Guitarist merch over at www.shopsamuraiguitarist.com. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button. If you want to watch another video like this one, hit that link up there. An extra big thank you to everyone who supports my channel through Patreon. I'm Samurai Guitarist, and I will see you again soon.